The return of October means the return to action of the U.S. Supreme Court. What can the court's recent past tell us about its potential future? Well, joining us with some interesting answers to that question is Daniel Gibson. He's an attorney with the Apex-based Stam Law Firm, and he recently discussed the U.S. Supreme Court's 2019 term with the John Locke Foundation's Shaftesbury Society. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
So in looking at this 2019 term, obviously you were studying it very closely. What are some of the things that stood out most to you?
I think the first thing to note is what I would call the odd majorities of the United States Supreme Court this term. Now, if we were expecting what I would call pure partisanship, which is the 5 conservative justices always aligning against the 4 liberal justices, we would have seen a very different term. What actually happened this term was there were 21 5-4 cases, but actually a plurality of those cases, which is 45%, went in sort of a more liberal direction. So what happened was the liberal justices, I think, were crafting opinions to pick off one of the conservative justices to join them. So you'd see 4 liberals and Roberts, or 4 liberals and Gorsuch. So instead of getting this partisanship that I think a lot of us were expecting, we actually got much more narrow Supreme Court decisions because the liberals obviously were narrowing the broadness of their holdings to attract an extra justice.
Do you get the sense that there was a concerted effort to do that?
You know, it's hard to say because we'd sort of have to put ourselves in their minds. But I've got to think, if I was a United States Supreme Court justice and the alternative was the 5 justices that I disagree with getting together and writing a very broad opinion that might, potentially overturn precedent that I care about, or sort of taking a smaller victory over a big loss, I'd take the smaller victory.
In looking at these cases, you mentioned that it's in a number of cases it was the 4 justices considered the liberal bloc with one of the members of the so-called conservative bloc. Do you get the sense then that is against this idea that we have a very strong conservative majority on the court?
I think it's really more against the idea of justices as purely partisan. And what I mean by that is, we think of Republican or conservative justices and Democrat or liberal justices. But really, I think these justices are people that are very well educated in the law and have a consistent judicial philosophy. And a lot of times that's going to yield predictable partisan results. But if someone is a pure originalist, in the vein of, say, Justice Thomas or Justice Gorsuch, you might find things that seem liberal, for instance, on criminal defendants' rights, because our Constitution is actually fairly liberal when it comes to the rights of the accused. On the other end of the spectrum, someone that's a pure pragmatist in a liberal judicial philosophy might sometimes give conservative results in cases because those are the results that they actually think are the most pragmatic. So I think it's really more a question of the underlying judicial philosophy than this justice always votes with the conservatives.
We are chatting with Daniel Gibson. He is an attorney with the Stam Law Firm in Apex, North Carolina, and he's been looking very closely at the 2019 term of the U.S. Supreme Court. When you went through these decisions, did they surprise you, or did you see that even if the outcomes, the 5-4 with the 4 liberals and 1 conservative coming together, they actually sort of fit in with what we have seen these justices rule about in the past?
Well, whenever you're dealing with 2 fairly new justices like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, sometimes it's hard to say what they're going to turn out to be like. And I think the biggest surprise in this term has actually been Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. Something that's really remarkable about them is they have one of the highest disagreement rates of any 2 justices appointed by the same president. So that means that a lot of times they're splitting their votes. And that sort of gets back to the partisanship question. I think Gorsuch is very much an originalist, wants to stick to the original meaning of the Constitution, doesn't really care about, changing interpretations of those words. On the other hand, Kavanaugh is more, I think, in the line of, say, a Chief Justice Roberts, that is more concerned about the appearance of the court, having a limited judiciary, things like that. So a lot of the surprises, in my opinion, came from Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Gorsuch. They were the ones that were most likely to split off and give us these sort of more unique cases.
You mentioned Kavanaugh, and it's a good time to remind folks that this is the first term when Kavanaugh actually
Yes.
played a role. Beyond what you've already said, anything else about Kavanaugh that struck you as interesting in his contributions to the court?
It's fairly early to say. He did align a lot with Chief Justice Roberts, which was not something I was expecting. There's always a question of he went through such a embattled nomination process. Has that perhaps shifted him in a direction where he wants to give a better appearance to the court? I was expecting Kavanaugh to be more in line with, say, Gorsuch, but obviously that didn't quite turn out the way that we were expecting.
So we have basically one term in hand with this court as it's currently constituted. Any things that you see looking forward that this could mean for the cases that are going to be coming before the court in the 2020 term?
I think something that's really interesting to note about the court is the inaction or relative inaction when it comes to pro-life or pro-choice issues. There have been cases that have come up to the court where they could have potentially taken those and narrowed or overturned Roe v. Wade, and they haven't chosen to do that. I think that that's probably the biggest message moving forward from this court is I think we're not going to see a whole lot of major intervention with this current makeup of the court. Roberts and Kavanaugh are now sort of the swing votes, and I think they're going to act as sort of a ballast for the court, so it's not going to go too far in either way, in either direction.
Given what we saw during the 2019 term, do you expect that there's going to be a lot of action behind the scenes once the new cases get started of the four-member so-called liberal bloc trying to find ways to get at least one of the conservatives on their side as they did in this past term?
I would expect that trend to continue. They're obviously very well educated, very intelligent people on the Supreme Court. And again, the incentive structure hasn't changed there. I think they still have an incentive to try to write an opinion that can be a small win for them, or at least a smaller loss, as opposed to a large win for conservatives or a large loss for liberals. So that's a trend that I expect to continue. Of course, I can't see the future, so I could be completely wrong on that.
In the brief time that we have left, does that also mean any sort of change in strategy on the other side, the conservatives, to try to find a way to keep them all together?
If I was a conservative jurist or I was a conservative attorney arguing at the Supreme Court, I would be thinking, what are the issues that I can pick off one of the liberal justices on? And maybe turn that 5-4 case into a 6-3 case. Maybe we can get Breyer to join the conservatives. Crazier things have happened. So, there's always a question of what your strategy and what your tactics are at the Supreme Court. And there's always sort of this game theory. If we do this, they'll do that, so on and so forth. So it should be an interesting term.